Hey everybody, and welcome to the second video from Chapter 7. Today we're going to be combining sections 7.2 and 7.3 together in one video where we talk about forward and futures contracts. So we're going to be talking about each one separately, and we're going to especially spend a lot of time on futures contracts since they're especially relevant to the topics of money and banking. So what is a forwards contract? Well, it's a type of derivative that is an agreement to buy or sell an asset at an agreed upon price at a future time. So basically, it is two people getting together saying for X dollars and for Y quantity, we're going to trade goods at some future point in time. And this is really especially used for trading commodities, which is why I say we don't care as much about forwards contracts as futures contracts. But it's still worth going over some terminology and examples because the terminology is so similar to futures contracts. First is a spot price. The spot price is just the price at which a commodity or financial asset can be sold at the current date. The settlement date is the date at which the delivery of a commodity or financial asset specified in a forward contract must take place. Finally, counterparty risk is that the risk that the counterparty or the person on the other side of the transaction will default. So let's redefine forwards contracts now with these terms. A forwards contract is an agreement between two parties to buy or sell an asset at a spot price on the settlement date. And one thing that these people need to consider is counterparty risk. So let's just use an easy example that we're going to talk about again later on with futures contracts. Let's look at farmers growing wheat. Farmers obviously are trying to maximize the profit when they grow wheat, but there's a lot that goes into play on the price of a bushel of wheat. For example, if it's a really rough summer with weather, there's a lot of tornadoes, maybe a heat wave, something like that, the price of a bushel of wheat is going to go up. Or another concern with that is that the farmer's crop may go bad. On the flip side, let's say that they're selling to General Mills. General Mills uses wheat for all sorts of products, but they are very concerned specifically about the price of wheat on the market. If the price of wheat goes up, General Mills either has to raise the prices of their products or risk turning a loss on the goods that they sell. So they may want to go into a forward contract that fixes the agreed upon price to the spot price and fixes a contractual obligation with the farmer in the future. And it could be mutually beneficial because on the flip side, the farmer doesn't want the price of wheat to go too low, so they can maintain, a set spot price. So those are what forward contracts are. Futures contracts are very similar. In fact, we can define them as a standardized contract to buy or sell a specified amount of a commodity or a financial asset on a specific future date. So if you look at this definition compared to a forward contracts definition, the only difference is that in a futures contract, we don't specify the price. We do specify the quantity. So these futures contracts are saying on X date, you're going to give me, Y amount of goods at whatever the spot price is on that date instead of in the contract date. So we'll get into what that means now in a little bit, but all these futures contracts are traded on a variety of exchanges, but these exchanges, and this is true for derivatives in general, aren't typically traded on like the New York Stock Exchange. One of the biggest clearinghouses for derivatives and futures contracts specifically is the Chicago Board of Trade, or the CBOT. Another one that you'll hear referred to quite a bit in derivatives markets is the New York Mercantile Exchange. So these are different, but they act, basically the same way as stock markets. It's just that instead of dealing with stocks or equity, they're dealing in the derivatives market. But uh, to make the default risk smaller with futures contracts, and this is also true with forward contracts, so these clearinghouses like the CBOT will sometimes sign on to the futures contract as another counterparty to reduce default risk. And why would they do that? Well, the big reason is so that one, they can get revenue from the profit, and two, so that they can generate trade on the exchanges, because especially in like times of recession, not a lot of people want to be dealing in derivatives markets, which hurts the CDOT. But we can calculate profit from futures contracts pretty easily. A profit from a futures contract for the buyer is just the difference between the spot price at settlement minus the futures price at purchase times the quantity. So let's use our bushels of wheat example again. Let's say that the price on the date of the futures contract for a bushel of wheat is $5. And then on the settlement date, when the futures contract is purchased, let's say that the price of wheat goes down to $4. Well, then the buyer, for every bushel of wheat that they buy, makes a profit of $1. However, on the flip side, for the seller, the formula is just reversed. So for each bushel of wheat, they would lose $1. So you're really banking on future price movements. So we can use these futures contracts to either speculate or hedge risk. And in this graph and the next one, we're going to talk specifically about how they can be used to hedge risk. So let's use the wheat farmer and General Mills again. A wheat farmer's biggest concern is lower wheat prices, whereas with General Mills, they're concerned about higher wheat prices. So how do you control for this risk? Well, for the wheat farmer, they can sell futures contracts so that they take a net short position in the futures market, but they have a long position in the spot market, if you remember our definitions of being short and long. However, at General Mills, they're going to do the exact opposite position. They're concerned about higher wheat prices, so they want to buy futures contracts so that they are net long in the futures market and they are net short in the spot market position. So if we go back, let's say that the dollar or the price for a bushel of wheat goes down by $1. Then the wheat farmer would lose $1 for the per bushel of wheat that they sell. Let's then say that they sell some futures contracts. Well, remember, since the buyer went down by $1 on a futures contract, the seller goes up by $1. So that hedged position will go up by $1, making their net profit zero on the market movement. And then it's the exact opposite for General Mills. And so at the end of the day, these farmers are very well off by trading in the futures market because they are able to reduce the amount of risk based off of some fixed spot price. And then that being said, there are also speculators that are operating in the background of this futures market. And these speculators have no intention of buying wheat. They just really want a piece of the action. They want to be able to bet on the positions of where wheat is going to go. And that is why it is so hard to predict actual exposures in different markets based off of price movements, because we can, as regulators or outside investors, differentiate movements in futures contracts between who's hedging and who is speculating. And that's why it's so hard to figure out how much exposure the U.S. Futures market has. Now we're going to go over one last example, and this one looks at a financial asset. In this case, we're looking at treasury notes and how we can use the futures market to hedge interest rate risk. So let's say some investor owns some treasury notes right now, but there's a pension fund manager that wants to buy treasury notes 6 months in the future. And the reason why they don't buy them right now, there's plenty of them. For example, they may just not have the funds available. They don't have the liquidity to buy the treasury notes. Or the pension fund manager may, want to wait for interest rates to go down so that or a higher interest rate so that they can get the treasury notes for a cheaper price. Either way, both the people or both parties are concerned about interest rate risk, if you remember back from chapter 4. So how do you minimize interest rate risk with treasury notes? Well, For an investor, you can sell futures contracts the same way that the wheat farmers sold futures contracts. This would mean that they're net short in the futures market and net long in the spot market. Meanwhile, the pension fund manager is the opposite. They can buy futures contracts and take a net long position in the futures market and a net short in the spot market. Now, as a quick note here, remember that for the fund manager, you may be saying, wait, hold up, Alex. We said that the pension fund manager doesn't have the liquidity to buy notes. Uh, how can they buy these contracts? Well, they have the liquidity in 6 months from now when the futures contract is exercised. So these futures contracts are a good way for the pension fund manager to actively participate in the market while dealing with lower liquidity because they're only entering into a contract. They're not actually buying anything until at some point in the maturity date. And so that's why futures contracts can circumvent liquidity issues. But that being said, you can see pretty clearly how this is a beneficial position for both the investor and the pension fund manager who are concerned about interest rate risk in the treasury notes. So if the treasury note prices rise, the investor loses in the futures market but gains on the spot market. So either way, they're okay. But on the opposite side, if the treasury note prices fall, they will be able to make a profit in the futures market to cut down out of some of those losses in the spot market. And for the pension fund manager, it's the exact opposite. So as you can see, you can go two ways with futures contracts, but if used intelligently and appropriately, they are actually a really good way to reduce risk to individual investors and the US economy as a whole. In the next video, we're going to talk about another really cool derivative called options. But for now, that is it on forward and futures contracts.